Auditor's response to risk assessment. So, auditors' judgments about the risk of material misstatements due to fraud may affect the audit in the following ways. First, engagement, staffing and extent of supervision. Ang engagement risk ay isang overall risk associated with an audit engagement. Included dito yung loss of reputation from being associated doon sa particular client and financial losses from the association. Kaya yung personnel na ina-assign nila sa mga engagement is knowledgeable and may ability na ma-assess yung risk sa engagement. Second, professional skepticism. Isa sa mga auditors' response. Professional skepticism, sobrang familiar na sa atin ito. So, ito yung attitude na includes a questioning mind. Ito yung nagiging alerto ka na sa mga conditions na may possible misstatement due to error or fraud. Third, nature, timing, and extent of procedures performed. The nature of further audit procedures refers to their purpose and their type, that is inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, recalculation, reperformance, or analytical procedures. Timing, ito naman yung kung kailan ipaperform yung procedure or the period to which the audit evidence applies. Extent refers to the quantity of a specific audit procedure to be performed. Response to detected misstatements due to fraud. The risk of material misstatement due to fraud always exists. Nag-e-exist talaga yung mga misstatement or fraud sa isang business, lalo na kapag yung business merong large volume ng mga transactions. Yung ginagawang response ni auditor dito, influence siya by the degree of assessed risk, meaning meron silang process na i-apply para ma-identify yung mga hazards and ma-evaluate yung mga associated risk. Bale, merong mga cases na yung audit procedure ay sufficient para ma-identify yung risk factors. Pero meron din namang cases na kailangang extend ni auditor yung audit para ma-adjust nila yung planned procedures. And meron din na rare case kung saan kino-conclude na ni auditor na hindi niya ma-address yung risk. Siguro hindi siya rito nakagather ng sufficient evidence, which is nagli-lead siya sa pag-withdraw doon sa engagement and need to communicate the reasons for withdrawal to the audit committee. When the auditor has determined that fraud exists but has had no material effect on the financial statements, the auditor should refer the matter to an appropriate level of management, at least one level above those involved, and be satisfied that implications for other aspects of the audit have been adequately considered. And kapag yung fraud naman ay mayroong material effects sa financial statement, si auditor kailangan niyang i-discuss yung matter and yung mga further investigation with an appropriate level of management. Kailangan din nilang i-determine yung effect nun sa financial statements and sa auditor's report. And i-report nila directly sa audit committee and suggest that the client consult with legal counsel. Documentation requirements. Auditor should document in the working papers yung benchmark na ginamit niya para ma-assess yung fraud risk factors. Sa documentation, merong two main points lang na included. First, yung risk factors na na-identify, and second, the auditor's response. Fraud detection techniques. Dahil kalat na ang mga fraud, mapamaliit man o mapamalaki na business at pag-falsify ng mga accounting records, many fraud schemes leave a trail in the underlying accounting data, tapos yung mga forensic auditor natatrace nila basta alam nila yung key points or yung hahanapin nila. And for those businesses na mayroong large volume of transactions, mahirapang i-trace yung trail doon lalo na kapag manual procedure lang yung gagamitin. Kaya advisable na gumamit ng computer-based data extraction and analysis tools such as ACL. Di ba yung ACL? Na-discuss na siya sa Chapter 9 and Chapter 10, kaya familiar na sa atin. Kaya i-recap ko na lang ACL or Audit Command Language. So, yung ACL, dinesign siya as a meta-language for auditors para ma-assess nila yung mga data na nakastored sa mga digital formats. And to find the trail in the masses of data, si auditor, kailangan niya mag-develop muna ng fraud profile or fake profile. Ito yung representation of a person, organization, or company na hindi naman talaga nag-e-exist. Once na ma-develop na yung fraud profile, dito na papasok si ACL, which can be used to manipulate the organization's data to search for transaction na fit doon sa profile. There are 3 common fraud schemes. First is yung payment to fictitious vendors. Second, yung payroll fraud. Third, yung lapping accounts receivable. Payments to fictitious vendors. Purchasing function is particularly vulnerable to fraud, and for many organizations, represents a significant area of risk. Purchasing function yung pinaka-at risk kasi according sa research na nabasa ko, maraming blind spots sa audit process. Yung collusion between buyer and seller, suppliers taking advantage of incompetent purchasing staff, and fraudulent activities by the buyer. So, common fraud scheme involves making payment to fictitious company. The initial step in this scheme requires the doer to create a phony vendor. Bali, yung phony vendor, isa siyang common type of purchasing scheme involves fictitious vendors. So, kailangan gumawa ni perpetrator ng phony vendor organization and establish it in the victim organization's record as a legitimate supplier. Then, isasubmit ni embezzler yung invoices from the fake vendor, which are processed by the accounts payable system of the victim company, depending on the organizational structure and internal control. Yung type ng fraud na ito is nire-require na collusion between 2 or more individuals. For example, yung purchasing agent, nag-prepare siya ng purchase order for items from the fake vendor. And si receiving clerk, nag-prepare ng fictitious receiving report for the items. Accounts payable receives these documents which appear to be legitimate and matches the phony invoice when it arrives. An accounts payable is recorded and payment is subsequently made. The payment is then diverted to the fraudster. This can be accomplished with nothing more than a fake name in the post office box. So the fraud profile describing the false vendor scheme and the audit procedures are described next. Sequential invoice numbers. The audit procedure is to use ACL to sort the records of the invoice file by invoice number and vendor number. Since yung victim organization yung only recipient ng invoices, yung supporting invoices na in-issued ni phony vendor may actually something close to an unbroken numerical sequence. So, yung procedure na gagamitin ay ACL, then isa-sort yung records of invoice file by invoice number and vendor number. Vendors with PO boxes. Mostly, yung mga legitimate suppliers, meron silang complete business address. Since fake yung supplier, wala silang physical store or physical facilities. And yung mga doer ng fraud, sometimes, they rent a post office box para makareceive ng payments by mail. Although, possibly rin na gumamit ng PO boxes yung legitimate vendor, so yung mga supplier na yon, candidate rin for further review. The audit procedure is using ACL Expression Builder. Create a filter to select vendor records from the invoice file that use PO Box addresses. Vendors with employee addresses. Rather than rent a PO box, the doer may use his or her home address on the invoice, although possible din naman na yung employee's home-based business is a legitimate supplier. So, yung audit procedure na gagamitin is ACL to join the employee file and the invoices file using the address fields as the common key for both files. Multiple companies with the same address. To divert attention away from excessive purchases made from the same vendor, so si perpetrator magkakreate pa siya ng several phony suppliers na magkakaparehas ng mailing address. ACL duplicate yung procedure na gagamitin dito. ACL duplicate commands to generate a listing of mailing addresses that are common to 2 or more vendors. Invoice amounts slightly below the review threshold. A management review and signature is required for all checks that exceed the threshold. Many organizations control disbursements by establishing a materiality threshold. Yung materiality threshold, ito yung dividing line between material and immaterial information. So, lahat ng mag-exceed sa threshold, nire-review muna ni management and kailangan mayroong signature. And those that fall below the limit are not reviewed. Knowing this, i-falsify ni perpetrator yung payments para ma-fall siya below the limit and para ma-maximize yung benefit niya doon sa fraud. So, ang gagamiting audit procedure ay ACL Expression Builder to create a value range around the control threshold. The second common fraud scheme is payroll fraud. Payroll fraud is the theft of cash from a business via the payroll processing system. Merong two common forms ang payroll fraud. First, yung overpayment of employees. Second is yung payments to non-existent employees. So, typically, yung first scheme involved dito yung pag-increase ng work number of hours ng employee and or issuing duplicate payroll checks. Second approach involves entering fictitious employees into the payroll system. The suggested audit procedures for detecting these frauds are described next. Test for excessive hours work. Yung audit procedure na gagamitin dito is yung ACL's Expression Builder para ma-sort out yung mga records na nagre-reflect ng excessive hours work. So, using this filter to review employee records over time may disclose a pattern of abuse. Test for duplicate payments. Duplicate payment is accomplished by asking the software to identify instances of payment kung saan combination siya ng same vendor, invoice number, invoice date, payment amount, purchase order number, and invoice item description were used within the disbursement register. Test for non-existent employees. ACL's join yung audit procedure na gagamitin dito. Bali dito, ililink niya yung payroll and employee files gamit yung employee number as the common attribute. Itong joined file na ito, ang laman lang dapat nito is yung mga record from the payroll file na hindi nagmatch sa valid employee records. Lapping accounts receivable. The last common fraud scheme. Lapping was described earlier in the chapter as the theft of a customer's check received in payment on his account. Lapping scheme is a fraudulent practice that involves altering accounts receivables to hide stolen cash, and the only evidence of fraud in the underlying data is in the timing difference between when payment is received and when it is recorded. The balance forward method, extensively for consumer accounts. Balance forward method inaallow ka to post sales and payments to maintain a balance for the current period. And at the end of the period, statements are printed and the period is closed. And lahat ng period transactions, isa-summarize yon and posted as the balance forward for the next period. So lapping is difficult to detect in this type of system. For example, si perpetrator, inistil niya yung bayad ni customer A na 500 pesos. Itong amount na ito, it will not be posted to the customer's account in the current period, and the balance carried forward to the next period would be overstated by 500 pesos. In the following period, cash taken from another customer, ayun yung gagamitin na pang-cover doon sa amount na in-steal ni perpetrator kay customer A. Yung customer naman, pwede naman sila mag-complain na hindi na-record yung payment niya. Pero kung yung embezzler himself yung nag-handle ng complaint, malulusutan niya yon. Pwede niyang sabihin na late nilang na-receive yung payment, kaya hindi nag-reflect sa current statement. Open invoice method. Open invoice is a detailed document that shows the amount owed and the due date of the payment. Generally, the invoice is sent by vendors to the accounting department or accounts payable department of the company that owes them. And para ma-illustrate yung lapping in this situation, customer A remits a check worth 1,523.61 payment of an open invoice, but perpetrator pockets the check but does not close the invoice. Kaya yung invoice balance na carried forward siya. Next period, customer B remits a check for 2,636.88 in full payment of an open invoice. Si embezzler, i-apply niya yung 1,523.621 payment kay customer A's open invoice, thus closing it. And yung balance or residue, ayun naman yung i-apply kay customer B's invoice which remains open, and the balance is carried forward into the next period. Table 12.10 is an example of sales invoice file. Audit procedure is as follows, assuming the organization follows proper backup procedures. The invoice file will be copied frequently throughout the period under review, thus producing several archived versions of the file. And if the auditor suspects lapping, he or she may utilize the following ACL test. ACL's expression builder to select item from each file version whose remittance amount field is greater than 0 and less than the invoice amount. Merge the resulting carry forward files into a single file. Calculated field the amount carried forward, and duplicates command to search the file for calculated carry forward amounts that are the same.